Saturday morning, 9:30, your mum hands you a list and £2 notes folded together and sends you out the door with a canvas bag over your shoulder. The list has 7 things on it. 7 things from 7 different shops, all of them on the same street, all of them within 200 yards of each other. You know every one of them. You know the smell of them, the sound of them, the particular way the door opens on each one. You know which shopkeeper will give you a little extra, and which one will weigh it twice to make sure you're not being shortchanged. You know the routine because the routine never changes. That high street was the centre of everything, and by the time you were grown up, most of it was gone. Let's start where every good Saturday morning started. The butcher. The smell hit you before the door even opened. Fresh sawdust on the floor, cold air that carried something metallic underneath it, and the particular clean smell of a shop where meat was the only business. The butcher was behind the counter before 7. He'd been there since 5. The carcasses came in early, and there was work to do before the first customer knocked on the glass. By the time the shop opened, everything was dressed, trimmed, and laid out under the white lights. Chops in a row, mince in a mound, kidneys in a dish, and a neat line of sausages that he'd made himself from a recipe nobody else had. He knew his trade because he'd been learning it since he was 14. You didn't walk into a butcher's shop and start cutting. You swept the floor first. You carried the deliveries. You watched. After years of watching, you were allowed to use the knife. After more years, you had a feel for it. A good butcher could look at a joint and know it. The way a carpenter knows timber, he knew his customers too. Mrs. Patterson took the best mince, always. The Hendersons wanted their lamb on a Friday without fail. Old Mr. Cooper came in every Tuesday for 2 pork chops and a bit of liver, and always had something to say about the weather. He knew the children too. When you came in with your mum's list, he'd look at it, look at you, and sometimes slide a thin slice of something across the counter. Try that. A piece of haslet, a sliver of polony, a bit of corned beef from the block on the end. Not every butcher did it, but a lot of them did. It was part of the education. You learned what things were by tasting them, and you remembered the shop because of it. If you were short on a Thursday, he'd note it down and square it up on Friday when the wages came in. Nobody made a song and dance about it. It was just how things worked on a street where everyone knew everyone. His prices were written in chalk on the board behind him. Rump steak at 4 shillings and 6pence a pound. Best mince at 1 and 9, a pound of his sausages for 2 bob. And when you handed over your mum's list, he'd talk you through it, wrap each piece in white paper, tie it with string, and write the price on the outside with a grease pencil. Everything neat, everything labelled. The bag weighed heavy on the walk home, and that was the point. The butcher did a roaring trade because there was no alternative. If you wanted meat in 1970, you went to the butcher. The supermarket nearest to most people was a small thing, if it existed at all, and what meat it stocked was wrapped in cling film on a polystyrene tray. The butcher's meat had been a living animal recently enough that the shop still smelled of it. That wasn't a problem, that was the proof it was fresh. And then things began to shift. In 1950, Britain had around 42,000 independent butchers. By 1980, that number had started falling. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. A trickle that would become a flood before anyone thought to do anything about it. The supermarkets got bigger, then they got enormous. The first out-of-town superstore opened in the early 1970s, and it sold everything, including a meat counter that was staffed. Yes, but staffed by someone who hadn't spent a decade learning the trade. The prices were lower because the buying power was enormous. A chain that moved £100,000 of mince a week could get it cheaper than a man running one shop ever could. The butcher tried to compete on quality, and he was right. His quality was better, his sausages were better, his knowledge was better. But the car changed everything. When people drove to a supermarket on a Thursday evening and bought everything for the week in one trip, the Saturday morning routine started to die. Not because people wanted it to, because convenience had a pull that was hard to argue with when you were tired and it was raining, and the big car park was right there. By the 1990s, the numbers were brutal. Thousands of butchers' shops had closed, and then came BSE mad cow disease. The crisis hit in the mid-1980s and exploded into public consciousness by 1990, and it didn't just frighten people about beef, it frightened people about meat in general, and it frightened them about where their meat came from and who was handling it, and whether any of it was safe. The independent butcher, who had always been the face of the meat trade, became in the public mind the symbol of everything uncertain about it. His relationship with his customers, built over years, took a serious blow. Some never recovered it. The ones that remained were the ones that found a niche. Organic meat before organic was a word people used. Specialist cuts. A particular kind of sausage that the supermarket couldn't replicate because replication required care and care required time and time costs money. The high street butcher didn't disappear entirely, but the one your mum sent you to on a Saturday morning, the one where he knew her by name and kept back the best bit for her because she'd been coming in since before you were born, that one is almost certainly gone. There are fewer than 6,000 independent butchers left in Britain today. From 42,000 to 6,000 in 70 years. The sawdust on the floor and the string around the white paper and the grease pencil on the outside of the parcel. All of it gone. The baker. You could smell the baker's shop from the other end of the street. Not the warm bread smell that candles now try to copy and never quite manage. The real thing. Yeast and heat and something slightly sweet underneath it all, coming out through the ventilation grill above the door in a warm cloud that stopped you in your tracks. The baker started work at 3 a.m, sometimes earlier. The bread had to prove, and proving took time, and the bread had to be ready when the shop opened. So the alarm went off in the dark and he went in and started the ovens and mixed the dough and the whole slow process began again, the same as it had the morning before and the morning before that, going back to whenever his family had first opened the shop. The loaves came out in batches, white tin loaves with a slight crack along the top where the crust had split in the oven. Brown loaves, denser, heavier, that kept better and went further. The split tin, the cottage loaf, the bloomer. Every bakery had its shapes. Every bakery had its particular crust because the oven was different, the hands were different, the recipe was different, and the combination of those things produced something that couldn't be copied in a factory. There were pastries, iced buns with a slash of white icing and a glacé cherry, custard tarts in their fluted cases, the custard just set, trembling if you carried the bag too fast. Chelsea buns rolled tight with currants baked into every layer, jam donuts fried that morning, still slightly warm, rolled in white sugar that stuck to your fingers. The bread counter ran along one side and the pastry counter along the other, and the woman behind the counter, it was usually a woman, used tongs for everything. You didn't touch. You pointed and she lifted it with the tongs into a white paper bag and twisted the top and told you the price, and that was the transaction. Simple, perfect. If you went in before 9 on a Saturday, you might get the batch rolls still warm from the oven, soft enough that the bag went transparent from the heat inside. The baker's wife sold them from behind the counter, and you could buy one separately for tuppence and eat it on the walk home. Nothing since has come close to that. Bread in 1970, Britain came from a bakery, nearly all of it. Sliced bread existed. Wonderloaf had been around since the 1930s, but it was considered inferior, something you bought when the baker was shut, a stopgap. The plant bakeries changed that. Wrapped sliced bread from a factory, produced by the million loaf, delivered to every supermarket in Britain at a price the high street baker couldn't touch, and the bread they were making had a secret. In 1961, the British Baking Industries Research Association in Chorleywood, Hertfordshire, developed a new way of making bread. The Chorleywood process, they called it. Instead of leaving dough to prove slowly over hours, the new method used intense mechanical mixing, extra yeast, and a cocktail of additives to produce a risen loaf in a fraction of the time. What took the high street baker 3 or 4 hours could now be done industrially in minutes. A factory could produce thousands of loaves in the time it took the baker to get through his morning batch. The bread lasted longer on the shelf because of what was in it. It was softer because of what was in it. And it tasted of considerably less because of what was in it. The Chorleywood process is still how around 80% of all bread made in Britain is produced today. Most people eating a slice of white toast in the morning have no idea that the bread was made by a method specifically designed to eliminate the kind of baker who used to live on their high street. By the mid-1970s, sliced wrapped bread was outselling everything else. The convenience of it was the thing. It stayed fresh longer. It was ready to slice because it was already sliced. You could buy it on Thursday and it would still be usable on Monday. The baker argued that his bread was better. He was right. But better didn't win when cheaper and convenient were the alternative, and the supermarket was the same place you bought everything else. The independent bakers began to close, some slowly, some quickly, depending on where they were and how stubborn they were, and how loyal their customers turned out to be when the choice arrived. A lot of shoppers felt genuine guilt choosing the supermarket. They did it anyway. By the late 1980s, the high street bakery was becoming rare. The chains moved in, Greggs expanded from the northeast across the whole country, and they were good, and they were cheap, and they were not the same thing. A Greggs sausage roll is a perfectly decent thing. It is not what came out of the back of a family bakery on a Saturday morning in 1971. Of all the shops that disappeared, the baker is the one people mourn most specifically. Because bread is not neutral. Bread has a smell and a temperature and a texture that connects to something very deep. And the bread that came from the local bakery connected to it in a way that no wrapped loaf ever has. The Greengrocer. A wooden board outside the door, sloping slightly toward the pavement, and on it the fruit and vegetables arranged in their compartments. Potatoes in a sack at the bottom. Onions hanging in a net. Apples polished to a shine and set out in a pyramid that wobbled slightly when you brushed past. Cabbages with their outer leaves still on because the outer leaves protected the ones inside. A bunch of bananas hanging from a hook by the door. A crate of whatever had come in that morning that he was particularly pleased with, priced up on a little card in his own handwriting. The greengrocer knew his stock the way the butcher knew his cuts. He knew which potatoes were floury, and which were waxy, and which you wanted for mashing, and which for roasting, and which held together in a salad. He knew which apples were for eating, and which were for cooking. He knew that the tomatoes were better on a Wednesday because that was when the delivery came in, and by Saturday the ones that were left were still good but not as good. He also knew what was in season because that was all he sold. This is the thing that has been almost completely lost. In 1970, a greengrocer sold what was growing: strawberries in June and July, sprouts in November, Cox apples in autumn, purple sprouting broccoli for a few weeks in spring, and then gone again until next year. The calendar of the year was written in what was on the wooden board outside the shop. Housewives knew it. They planned around it. You didn't expect strawberries in January because strawberries didn't grow in January. This made the things that were in season taste more important. Strawberries in June with cream were an event. You'd waited for them. When they were gone, and you didn't get them again until next summer. The greengrocer bought his stock from the wholesale market. He might have been there himself at 5 in the morning, walking the stalls at the local market, picking through the produce, arguing over the price of a pallet of beetroot, loading up his van. Or he might have had it delivered, depending on how big the operation was. Either way, the chain between field and shop was short, 3-4 steps at most. What went on the board outside his door had come out of the ground recently. He sold by weight, using brass scales on the counter, adding weights to one side and produced to the other until they balanced. Sold by the pound, by the bag, by the bunch. He'd pick it up with his hands, feel it, turn it over and tell you whether it was good or whether he had better at the back. If he had better at the back, he'd go and get it. Potatoes were 2p a pound, carrots 3p a bunch, a cabbage for 6p, a punnet of strawberries when they were in season for a shilling. Everything seasonal, everything fresh, everything chosen by someone who knew what choosing meant. The supermarkets changed what people expected. First, they made everything available all year round, importing out of season produce from wherever in the world it happened to be growing. Courgettes in December, strawberries in January, peppers in February. The seasonal rhythm of eating broke down, not all at once, but steadily, as people got used to being able to have whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. Second, they standardized everything. The tomato had to be a certain size, a certain color, a certain weight. It had to look the same every time you bought it. The slightly misshapen one that the greengrocer might have priced lower because it was perfectly good but wouldn't photograph well, that tomato vanished. The supermarket's tomato was uniform, predictable, and considerably less flavoursome. Third, they drove the price down to a point where the greengrocer couldn't compete, not because the greengrocer was inefficient, but because a chain buying 10,000 tons of carrots paid a fraction of what he paid for £200. The greengrocers began to close through the 1980s. Some went quickly. Some held on into the 1990s, and a handful survived today, mostly in market towns, or in areas where the local community was willing to pay slightly more for something that was genuinely better. But in most high streets, the wooden board outside the door is gone. The brass scales are in an antique shop somewhere. The seasonal rhythm of eating has been almost entirely replaced by a kind of permanent sameness. Everything available, everything identical, everything tasting of nothing in particular. These 3 shops weren't brought down by a single thing. It was a combination, and the combination worked because each part reinforced the others. The supermarkets arrived first as small shops and got bigger. Through the 1960s and 70s, they were still manageable competitors. Through the 1980s, they became something else. The big out-of-town sites, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Asda, Morrison's, were building stores the size of aircraft hangars and filling them with everything that had previously required a dozen separate trips. The car made those stores possible. When you drove, distance was no longer a problem. The supermarket could be 3 miles from the town centre because everyone had a car and nobody minded driving 3 miles to park for free and do everything in one go. Then came the planning decisions. Councils waved through out-of-town retail parks through the 1980s without fully understanding what they were doing to the high streets. By the time the damage was visible, the permissions were already granted, the stores were already built, and the habits were already formed. The business rate system made it worse. Rates are calculated on the rental value of a property, and through the 1980s and 90s, as high streets struggled, the valuations didn't always reflect that struggle quickly enough. A butcher or greengrocer whose trade had dropped by a third could still find himself paying rates on what the property had been worth 5 years earlier when things were better. The supermarket on the ring road, with its enormous floor space spread across cheap land, often paid proportionally far less per pound of turnover. The small shop subsidised the giant. Nobody planned it that way, but that was the effect. Add the fact that more women were working full-time, and the Saturday morning routine of visiting 7 different shops was no longer possible for many families. A single weekly shop was practical. It was necessary. The high street, which assumed you had time to walk slowly from butcher to baker to greengrocer, couldn't compete with the shop that assumed you had an hour on a Thursday evening. And here is the thing that never gets said. When those shops closed, the people who ran them didn't retire to the countryside. The butcher who had been in that shop since his father handed it to him had nothing to sell and nothing to fall back on. The lease was over, the equipment was worthless, the goodwill, which is what a business's loyal customer base is called when you're trying to sell it, was worth nothing when there was nobody left to buy a butcher's shop on that street. He was in his 50s, with a trade that the world had decided it no longer needed, and he started again from nothing. Thousands of them did, and nobody made a documentary about it. The specialness of those shops didn't vanish because people stopped valuing it. It vanished because the conditions that made it possible to run them had changed, and those conditions had been changed by decisions made by people who either didn't understand or didn't care what they were destroying. Everything that we lost. The butcher who knew your mum's name and kept back the best mince for her. The baker whose bread smelled so good on a cold morning that you stood outside the shop for a moment just to have it. The greengrocer who told you the strawberries were in, and they were the best he'd had in years. 3 people who knew their trade so well that they could tell by looking, by feeling, by smelling, whether what they had was good or not. 3 shops that made Saturday morning a reason to be out on the street. 3 pillars of a high street that is now mostly empty units and charity shops, and the same chains you see in every other town in the country. The Saturday morning list has gone. The canvas bag, the £2 notes folded together, the 7 different shops. All of it has gone. The supermarket does it faster and cheaper and less well, and we accept that because the alternative was dismantled before most of us fully understood what we had. There are still a few of them left. You might have one near you if you're lucky. Proper butcher who makes his own sausages and knows your name. A baker who starts at 3 in the morning and whose bread smells the way bread is supposed to smell. A greengrocer with a board outside the door and brass scales on the counter. If you have one, use it, not out of sentiment. Because what they know, what they do and what they sell is genuinely better, and when they close they are not replaced. If your family had a butcher, a baker or a greengrocer they used, the name of the shop, the street it was on, the person behind the counter, drop it in the comments. Tell us what you remember. Some of those names deserve to still be heard. Please subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive.